The OCP Critical Facilities Operations Framework. We will look at the process work orders and project management in this webinar. We will start by having a process overview to see the types of activities involved. We will have some customer experience and lessons learned, and also leave you with some final notes to consider when you work with this type of process. But first of all, let us look at where the work orders and project management process resides in the OCP Critical Facilities Operations Framework. It is part of the delivery model, and it is a site management process, which we have here in the middle of site operations. There is a separate webinar that tells you where to find and download this free-to-use framework. The process is up in the right-hand corner of site management, and let's look at the process now. The work orders and project management covers anything that is being planned, ordered, and followed up, regardless if it's on-site works or off-site works. But typically, many of these things are on-site works. It could be refurbished projects, or it could be a planned maintenance service or anything else. But it could also be off-site services such as risk management planning or business development and other things. One of the most important things, or a critical part of site operations, is to make sure that the site operations is not jeopardized from a security perspective or an operational standpoint. And that means that a service request entails several approval points or decision points, and the first one I would say, or one of the most important, is the risk assessment. If we want to do this work, what are the risks and how do we mitigate these? Can we avoid the risks completely, or how can we minimize the risks of something going wrong? A typical example is that if you have planned works on site and it needs to be performed within a certain time limit, how long do you need to be at a certain time point before you consider yourself that this will not work and you have to backtrack and return to previous state. So that means you need to have a fallback plan, that if you're not able to finish the works on time, you need to be able to backtrack so we're back at least at the same state that we were before we started. Another part is, of course, the cost assessment. Is this something that should be included in the already budgeted costs, or does this add new costs, regardless if that is time or materials? Based on these things, we should find a suitable time and date to perform the work and to deliver its results. And that means that we provide a permit to work slot that makes sure that we do not jeopardize the site operations or the end users that rely on its operations. So perhaps it's not a good idea to perform the work at month's end, because that's when this critical facility is mostly used. Then let's do the work in the middle of a month instead. And then when the work is supposed to be done, it should be reviewed and approved, or if you like, accepted, that yes, this is what we intended to be done, and it's been done well enough, including the documentation. That is important to remember. It's not enough to do a good technical job unless you also document it, because if you change something to the site configuration, that needs to be documented. Otherwise, we have started the route down a dangerous path of having a mismatch between documentation and the real life situation or the live environment. So those are the major steps in this, and typically the site management function plans and requests these works to be done, and also reviews and approves them afterwards. But it could also be someone else, for example, the site owner or the customer. The important thing with service requests is that they are within the scope of the contract or the agreement. So even if this is an internal relationship with a department delivering site operations to other departments, there is a statement of work showing what they should deliver as part of their agreed delivery. For works that are included in that, you provide service requests. That leads us to what is a change request then? Well, according to facility management standards and the CFOPS of the Open Compute project, a change request, as opposed to the service request, is actually when you want to change something that affects the scope of the delivery. So if you have an external supplier, this would affect the contract. It could be that to make something large, you could add a new site into the scope of the project, or you could decrease by, for example, let's say closing down one of several sites, so you reduce the size of the portfolio that is being managed. It could also be that you move the border list responsibilities so that the risk is pushed from one party to another, which means that as the risks then get affected by this, the party taking a higher risk would want to either be paid more if it's the supplier, or if it's the customer, they would like to pay less because they carry a larger part of the risk. It could also be a contract being split between several suppliers, which would change the scope of these, and so forth. And that means that before you make a change request, you should have a business case showing the value of this proposed change. You also need to include a risk assessment to show what could be the potential negative consequences or the risks with this, and how should these risks be mitigated. In a perfect world, that means eliminating the risks of something going wrong, but in reality, it often means how do we minimize the risks, or how do we try to compensate for any potential risks so that we can avoid them. And based on that business case and risk assessment and the proposed change, you get the appropriate approvals through the governance escalations. Depending on the complexity and scale of the changes proposed, it may be approved already on operational level by the site management function. Otherwise, it might have to be escalated to the tactical level or even the strategic level. Then once the business case and the change request has been approved, that's when you perform the actual change to the contract. And when that is updated, you carry on the work as previously, but within the new scope, of course. So, lessons learned. Well, in this case, it's a real example from an agreement that required the site management function to receive written approvals by the site owner before executing any service requests. So every service request, even though they were included in the contract scope, needed written approval by the site owner. And the reason for this was that the site owner was extremely risk avert and did not want to have things being done to the site without the owner being informed and pre-approving these. The problem was that at the same time, the same customer organization were unused to making formal decisions. They were used to having informal chats and saying, yeah, that sounds great, let's do that. Now I am informed. But the contract specifically stated that it was required written approvals before any changes. And the supplier followed the contract, of course. So after a year of some frustration and noise in the organizations, the solution was that they made a change request, the joint change request on operational level, to update the so-called authorization matrix, which was an appendix to the agreement on who was allowed to make which decisions. They updated that to include already pre-approved levels based on financial triggers and complexity triggers, which meant that up to a certain cost level and up to a certain complexity level, it was okay for the site management function to actually approve service requests without having a written pre-approval by the site owner. And this new matrix was escalated to the tactical level where it was approved, and it was also approved on strategic level, which means that the contract was updated, and after that update, the site management function could have these more informal follow-ups and just or pre-approvals, if you like, saying, so we're planning to do this. Do you have any opinion? No, that sounds good. And they could deliver these things without having the frustrations. So that's a good example of when the intent was good to keep in control, but it actually blocked a pragmatic work environment. And some final notes on this. One important thing is that critical facilities, that can be the power and communications provisioning for a hospital or a airport or a telecom operator, of course, but in many instances, it's a data center, and most data centers in the world are governed by ITIL when it comes to the IT services. And the ITIL doesn't use the term service request and change request. It only uses the terminology change request, and that covers both types. So this is an important thing to take notice of, that if the site management team or the site operations team work on a data center and the site owner or the customer representative is the IT organization, it's important to make sure that there is no miscommunication when it comes to change requests and service requests. And also the work order and project management process includes several decision points. Therefore, it's important to have this integrated between the customer organization and the supplier organization to make sure that there is efficiency in these governance escalations when they are needed, even if they are just between the organizations on an operational level. Hoping you will join us in the other webinars on processes.